99% of PhDs say we evolved. It almost doesn't matter what I say next. How could so many smart people be wrong? If what the creationists say is true, then why does nearly everyone in the professional scientific community disagree? The evidence that's cited for evolution is weak. Exhibit A for evolution is something the creationists predicted. 99% of college students that are going to go to a university all they will ever hear is evolution the entire time. The reason 99% of PhDs are evolutionists is because that's all they're ever taught. What I want to show you this morning is a revolution. And revolutions sometimes come from unexpected places. And this revolution that gives us the new way for creationists to win is one that's been happening below the surface in the background for about a decade. It's a quiet revolution. You may not have heard about it. It's a new revolution. It hasn't made it into our displays here at the Creation Museum or Ark Encounter because it's too new for that. But this is something that turns the creation evolution debate upside down. That's why I'm calling it a revolution. And we're going to get to it in a series of 3 steps, 3 questions to bring us all up to speed. This is not some nerdy technical scientific talk, but something that I hope rocks your world. Because it should rock, I think, the whole world of the United States. It's that big. And I've made a bunch of promises. I'll let you evaluate whether or not I can keep them. But let's begin not with the revolution, but with the elephant in the room. So it almost doesn't matter what I'm going to tell you in the next 45, 50, 60 minutes because of a certain statistic. So if you hear what I say today and you're excited and you want to walk outside these walls and tell it to your neighbor, tell it to your unsafe family member, or maybe you're connected to the university system. And I've had people contact me, hey, I'm the secretary for the biology department at such and such university. I'm really excited to pass your book to this person. What are you going to hear? What's one of the first things you're going to hear? You're going to hear these statistics. They come from the Pew Forum, but they're representative of what's going on in the United States and really in the Western world. This is a survey, I think this was done 2015, of members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS, probably the biggest professional scientific organization in the United States. And among PhDs, if you look at these numbers here on the screen, 99% of PhDs say we evolved. This isn't the full evolution questions about human origins, but it's a nice representative question. 99% would reject what I'm about to tell you. And that statistic is what trips a lot of people up. Or is going to be the main argument against whatever you tell them. Like I said, it almost doesn't matter what I say next. The first question someone's going to ask you is, well, if what you say is true, if what he says is true, if what the creationists say is true, then why does nearly everyone in the professional scientific community disagree? How could so many smart people be wrong? It's a fair question, and we'll come back to it, and it leads to our first step, our first question in talking about Darwin and getting to the new way for creationists to win and towards the revolution. Some people see these statistics and say, let's give up. Why should we even fight it? Maybe there isn't a good explanation for why 99% of PhDs are evolutionists, except that they're right. Is that what we should do? There's whole professional organizations dedicated to convincing the church that evolution is true and that Christians should accept it. And that it's perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable, perfectly compatible with Christianity to do so, and they'll dress up this thesis in Christianese, in Christian language. Let's just find a peaceful solution. This book by Daryl Falk, PhD, I think he's out in California, one of the universities out there, Coming to Peace with Science. And his way of coming to peace with science is to accept it and then redo Genesis to make it compatible with evolution. Francis Collins, you may have heard his name because he was the former head of the National Institutes of Health in the United States. His book, The Language of God, A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief, is evidence for evolution. He accepts it. And he founded the organization BioLogos, one of the more well-known theistic evolutionary organizations in the United States, for the purpose of convincing the church, yes, accept evolution, and it's perfectly compatible with Christianity. Well, I've used the term evolution several times. What is it? What exactly are they trying to convince Christians of? What exactly do 99% of PhDs accept? And in summary, it's the idea that about 14, 15 billion years ago, there was a big explosion. And billions of years later, the earth evolved. All of this is strictly natural processes, no divine intervention. Even the theistic evolutionists, those who say, I accept God, I accept Christianity, and I accept evolution, they would not say that God is starting the Big Bang per se, or that he's creating the earth. It's all natural processes. Somehow God is behind all this in a loose, undefined sort of way. But this is not divine intervention. This is not God of the gaps. They're saying, no, we accept the full evolutionary narrative as you learned it in textbooks. And we kind of add Christianity to it. So you follow that mainstream narrative further. 4.6 or so billion years ago, the earth forms, evolves, strictly natural processes, no divine intervention. Billions of years later, the first life forms evolve, strictly natural processes. Some sort of primordial goo just happens to evolve the first life forms, eventually the first cells. The first cells keep evolving to the first bacteria. Eventually, fish and stuff evolve millions of years later. Those evolve onto land. Some of them evolve into amphibians, reptiles, mammals. Some of those mammals evolve back into the ocean and become whales, as if it weren't complicated enough. And some of those land mammals eventually, millions of years later, at the way tail end of the evolutionary process, evolve into people. That's the evolutionary idea. Biologos, the organization Francis Collins founded, is dedicated to convincing you that evolution is true and that it's perfectly okay for Christians to do so. Originally, they had sort of a evangelistic focus that seems to have been dropped in favor of just focusing on Christians. Should Christians do this? The evolutionary narrative I just told you is a direct contradiction to Genesis 1 and other passages in Scripture. The timing of creation is wrong in evolution, according to Scripture. The order of creation is wrong. So there is a group of old earth creationists. They say we reject evolution, but yes, God created slowly and gradually over billions of years, and they accept the mainstream account, except for the natural processes part. The order in which things appear contradicts what Genesis says. Perhaps the biggest problem, though, with evolution is its theology. The whole idea of evolution is that death and suffering is a good thing. The main mechanism Darwin invoked to explain how humans evolved from all that stuff over billions of years is natural selection, survival of the fittest to reproduce. Death is a good thing. Evolutionists would say, you and I are here, you're sitting in this room, because some other species died and made room for you. We wiped those other species out. That's why we're here. Death is a good thing. This is a graphic slide, and it's supposed to be, because that's the process that theistic evolutionists are trying to call and harmonize with very good, very good. God saw all that he was made and was good. That's what they're calling good. If you try to harmonize evolution with Genesis 1, this is what you get. And the problem, of course, is theologically, from Genesis to Revelation, death is an intruder. Genesis, the plain reading of it, says that God creates a perfect world without sin, without death. And because of Adam and Eve's sin, death is introduced and God curses all of the creation. And someday, all that's going to be reversed. Death is going to be no more. Suffering is going to be no more. Sorrow is gone. That's the hope of the Christian. That's the hope of Christianity. That's why Jesus comes and dies, takes away our sin. And the offer of Christianity, the hope of the Christian forever in heaven, is not some sort of natural selection for billions of years. That'd be an awful future. Instead, it's the reversal of this. It gets worse, though, as if you didn't think it could, it can. Biologos openly questions Adam and Eve. In a sense, this is the logical deduction. You can't really harmonize Genesis 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 with evolution. It's a gross contradiction. Which means then you got to reinterpret Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all those chapters, which talks about the creation of Adam and Eve. Were they historical figures, is what Biologos asks. And their answer is no. Because now, with the advent of the field of modern genetics and DNA, which is something Darwin never had access to, there's new data and new arguments. And the new data in the mainstream account is that there was never a point in human history, in human evolutionary history, going back to the cavemen and the ape men and all that, never a point in that history when there was just two individuals. There was always a population of at least several thousand. So therefore, no Adam and Eve is what Biologos concludes, because they accept the evolutionary account, they accept the mainstream account and try to harmonize it with Genesis, and they harmonize it by destroying the text, by denying it. Why is this a big deal? This is the logic of the gospel. What does the New Testament say? Paul's logic in Romans. So the book of Romans, of course, one of the clearest, most explicit statements in Christianity, in Scripture, for what the gospel is. I grew up in church. I grew up in the Awana program, memorizing lots of verses. We had lots of Romans verses, because this is the core, the heart of Christianity. What does Paul say is the basis for the gospel? For Jesus coming and dying on our behalf, substitutionary atonement, just as through one man sin entered the world. That one man, of course, is Adam. And if there's no one man, because there's always a population, never a pair, what do? Paul says, if by the one man's offense many died, much more the grace of God and the gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abounded to many. One more, and then I'll tell you a story from my own upbringing. For if by the one man's offense death reigned through the one, much more those who receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one Jesus Christ. The logic is one man sins, one man saves. If you don't have the one man sinning, it's a population of sinners. Is there one Savior? Or are there many ways to God? Is there a whole population of Saviors? So at some point, actually I think this is after I was of college age, I went back home to Wisconsin where I grew up, my home church, and was talking to one of the pastors about how it bothered me. I'm like, I understand the basic doctrine, we're sinners by nature and by choice. We all sin, we recognize that, but it's that by nature part that had bothered me. Why am I responsible for something? Why am I punished for something I'm not responsible for? Adam sinned, why do I bear the consequences? And so he listened, he said, okay, I understand what you're saying. Jesus took your punishment, even though he did nothing wrong. He bore the consequences of something he's not responsible for, in a sense. He's dying in your place, even though he doesn't deserve it. If you want to complain about the Adam part, you should also complain about the Jesus part, because it's not fair to him. That's basically what I'm saying. It's not fair that I have to bear the consequences of Adam's sin. Well, it's not fair to Jesus to bear the consequences of my sin. I said, no, I want to keep the Jesus part, so I'll accept the Adam part. That's the logic of Scripture. And it was a good answer that he gave. If you destroy through evolution and the new genetic data, evolutionary genetic data, the idea that there was one man, you destroy the rest. So this is a direct attack on the gospel. The New Testament opens with a genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, from Abraham down to Jesus. Luke takes you all the way back to Adam to show us Jesus is, in the terms of 1 Corinthians 15, the last Adam. So if the first Adam is just some stand-in word for something that's not literally true, just a metaphor, what is Jesus? A metaphor too? What do you take literally and what do you take figuratively? You really start doing damage to Scripture. So 99% of PhDs hold evolution. Should we just give up? You may as well give up Christianity if you're going to do that, because you can't harmonize it. One more story. I was giving a lecture at Boston College, a Catholic university, and we had trouble finding an opponent to respond to my lecture. There was a philosophy professor who agreed to it, friendly guy, held evolution, I think Catholic by theological profession. So I gave my talk, he gave some response, and then I was talking to students one-on-one afterwards. A girl came up and was asking me, I don't know, about carbon-14 dating, some question. The professor comes over, interrupts, and says, what is it with you Protestants? Why do you guys make such a big deal about Genesis? Because, we Catholics believe that the Bible is without error as it relates to the gospel, to the key theological doctrines, but not on things of historical or scientific nature. So that's what you would call limited inerrancy, which is kind of a contradiction in terms, because if it's without error, except in these parts, what does that even mean? Anyway, so I said, well, that's why Protestants make a big deal about it, because we believe the Bible is without error from the very first verse to the very ending verse, not limited to these certain areas. Anyway, so he walked off, and the girl who was listening to all this said, I can't believe that. So she understood. She's like, I can't wake up every morning and try to pick and choose which parts of the Bible I believe, which parts I don't. I can't live that way. She understood the implications. Big implications if you compromise with Darwin. No, you can't if you want to keep the Bible intact, keep your faith intact. Evolution contradicts the Bible. So second question then. 99% of PhDs hold evolution. Can't compromise with evolution because you may as well throw out the Bible, which is what some of these professors are doing, Darrell Falk, Francis Collins, essentially undercutting the Bible, slicing it piece by piece, and at some point there's nothing left. Should we just back out of science? Maybe we just leave it all alone. It's too rough, too intimidating. I can't take it, someone might say. I want to walk you through some of the main arguments for evolution, not all of them for sake of time, but some of the most compelling ones, that at least ones that creationists might feel are intimidating. I'll try to pick the best ones. And these are ones, if you remember back to high school biology, you've probably encountered. And really, the arguments for evolution haven't changed since Darwin, 150 years. They've taken new forms, but the same logic applies for the past century and a half. So if you're a student, or if you have students, children, grandchildren, these are likely the arguments they will have brought home from public school if they go there, or from public university. So I went to non-Christian universities for undergraduate and graduate school. These are the types of things that will show up in textbooks to this day. We'll keep it understandable. So 3 common evidences for evolution. Start with the first one, homology. What is homology? Homosexual is same sex. Homo is same. Ology is the study of, so the study of sameness is the idea, biological similarity. This diagram might ring more of a bell than that word does. The idea is, so if you were to take my forelimb and strip away the hair, the skin, the muscles, the nerves, everything until it's just bone, it would look something like this, where you have one bone on top here, then a set of 2 bones here in the forearm, then my wrist bones, and then I've got digits. If you were to do something similar, strip the 4 limbs of these other species down just to the bones, you'd have similar structures. 1 bone, 1-ish bone here for the frog, wrist bones, digits. Of course, the frog forelimb looks very different than ours, webbed and such. The bat wing is their forelimb, 1 bone, wrist bones, digits. The wing obviously looks very different from my arms, but it's got a similar underlying structure. The porpoise swims through the water, has a flipper, very different from my hand, yet it's got 1 bone, 2 bones, wrist bones, digits. Similar underlying anatomical bone structure. The horse has a leg for a forelimb that runs on it, unlike my arm. Of course, I'm standing on my legs and use my arms for something else. 1, 2, wrist, digit. The evolutionists look at this and say, how do you explain it? And if we were to summarize evolution in Darwin's terms, his term was descent with modification. There's 2 arms to it, or 2 parts to it. Descent, common ancestry. That's the idea that all of life is related. Humans are related to the chimpanzees, to the elephants, to the bacteria, to everything on this planet. We're just evolved animals, is what evolution says. Descent, that's the idea. With modification. That's how natural selection takes this descent and then starts modifying it for different environments. That's the idea. Descent with modification. So evolution does not expect the entire planet, all the life on it, to look identical. It does postulate that all life has common ancestry and that natural selection has modified it for different ends over time. So they would say, yes, see, the porpoise flipper looks obviously different from the bat wing, from the human arm, all that. There's differences. That's what natural selection does. But the underlying anatomical pattern is due to descent. Descent with modification. This family tree is what they would say explains this underlying anatomical pattern. And that's the only explanation. In fact, the evolutionists would make arguments along these lines. They would say, if you have a designer, there's 1,000 different ways to design the forelimb of the bat versus the frog versus the human. And it just so happens that the designer seems to have picked an underlying common pattern. That just seems hokey, is their logic. Evolution being the only explanation. Well, is that true? What does Genesis say? Genesis does not tell us every single species or kind, is the better word, every kind that God created. It doesn't give us the list of those. It doesn't even tell us the patterns in which he created. It's a fairly short chapter. If you think about all the detail God could have given, he could have given us pictures, blueprints with every fine last structure in every creature. But he didn't. Instead, Genesis 1 tells us that God created man and humans in his own image. In the image of God, he created Adam and Eve, which means there's something about you and me, all of us being descendants of Adam and Eve, something about you and me that reflects something about God. So if we look at how humans have designed things, maybe we'll get some insights into how God might have done so, because we're made in his image. So here's 3 vehicles that, if you just glance at it real quick, you'll notice look pretty similar. They're all blue for one. They've got 4 wheels. Of course, the hubcaps or wheels right here differ among these 3 vehicles, but they've got a sloping front windshield. They've got 4 doors. They've got a hatchback in the back, lights in the front. If you looked under the hood or you went inside, there's a steering wheel, there's brakes, there's a gas pedal, all that. Similarities and differences. So these 3 cars come from 3 different manufacturers who are based ultimately in 3 different continents. Toyota, based in Asia, Volkswagen, German, based in Europe, and Ford, of course, based here in the United States and North America. Why is there an underlying pattern of similarity and differences. Descent with modification, right? That's what evolution would say. Human designers have 1,000 different ways they can design cars. And somehow, Asian manufacturers, European manufacturers, North American manufacturers all land on the same design. It's not because all three vehicles evolved from a common ancestor over billions of years from some precursor, primitive car in the Arctic. We all recognize that as silly. It's because 4 wheels works better than 5 or 3. 4 doors makes it easier to get people in and out. Hatchback. Anyway, there's a common purpose that explains the underlying common design. We take it for granted. We don't even recognize it. It's so common in our culture and in the experience of humanity. It's normal. Evolution's not the explanation. Human designers naturally do this. Why wouldn't God do the same thing? In the biological world, if this design works well, 1, 2 wrist digits, why not reuse it? Creation explains this equally well. So here's the problem. If you think of it in terms of, let's say, a courtroom, you're trying to convict evolution of being the explanation for life as we know it, for specifically this underlying anatomical pattern. The evolutionists want you to believe that. They want your students, your children, your grandchildren to believe this. See evidence for evolution. The problem is, so let's say you're trying to convict someone of murder in the courtroom, and the prosecuting attorney comes along and says, look at this evidence, and these fingerprints, and this weapon, and all this that we find at the scene of the crime, tying the crime to that individual. Then the defense attorney comes along and says, well, see, they were framed on this count, and this is the explanation for this piece of evidence, and finds alternative explanations for every single one of those supposedly convicting lines of evidence. You'd be stuck. If you're part of the jury, you'd be stuck because none of the evidence is conclusive. That's what I'm saying is going on here. The evolutionists say evidence for evolution. See? When in fact, it's also equally valid to say it's evidence for creation. And so effectively then, we, the jury, or the students who they're trying to persuade, the jury, are stuck. The only way this can be evidence for evolution is if the evolutionists find some way to eliminate creation as an explanation. In a sense, they think they do, because they just say, that's religion, and they don't talk about it anymore. So, a very clever strategy. I'm just going to eliminate my opponent before I ever start arguing and see all the evidence is for evolution. Clever, very good. But of course, it's not persuasive because you can't just disqualify your opponent. It's kind of cheating. And then proceed to look at the evidence. They don't think it's cheating because they would say it's religious, not scientific. We'll come back to that topic in a minute. The point being, I've just showed you that this is equally compatible with creation. Somehow the evolutionist has to eliminate that idea of creation before they can conclude evolution. Now, if you're sitting there saying, well, that doesn't sound like a strong silver bullet against evolution, it's not. That's not my point, that this is somehow overturning evolution. My point is I've just neutralized one of the strongest arguments for evolution because it gets them nowhere. Second line of evidence, and my goal again is simply to show you that I can neutralize this. It's not the silver bullet, but the question we're trying to answer is, should we just back off of science? And I want you to see, no, it's not the threat that it seems to be. It's much less of a threat. It's not a silver bullet against the Bible. You can do science because the arguments against creation science are very poor and weak. Transitional forms. What's this? This is a picture from the National Science Foundation of a supposed transitional form called Tiktaalik. You can see that it has, on most of its body, scales like a fish. And if you look at the part that's in the water, it kind of has fins like a fish. But if you look at the part here that's on land, the front parts look less like fins, more like flippers, almost like limbs for walking. And the head definitely doesn't look fish-like. It looks like an amphibian or a reptile. So this is what the evolutionists would say is one of the premier examples of a transitional form, meaning it blends the features of different creatures. This depiction clearly blends the features of fish and land animals, aquatic animals and land animals, and they'd say this is exactly what you'd expect if evolution were true. Over millions of years, to evolve something from the water to the land, you have to go through all sorts of tiny modifications, slowly, progressively, gradually, until finally you get some sort of land mammal. And in the process, these sorts of species should appear, and they should appear in the fossil record. So what do you do with this? This is another evidence they would cite as, see, voila, proof of evolution. Does the Bible talk about transitional forms? in Genesis chapter 1? Does it give us a list of creatures that God created? No and no. But it does tell us we're made in his image. Adam and Eve are made in his image. We are descendants of Adam and Eve, so therefore we're also made in God's image. What do human engineers do? What do they build? I'm going to use a military analogy or an example and make an analogy to what we're seeing in the biological world. I like weaponry and military, have liked it my whole life, maybe because I'm a guy, so I think guns and all that sort of stuff and firepower is cool. So here's a Ticonderoga class cruiser that's got lots of firepower, cruise missiles, guns. It's well designed, well engineered to defend itself and to bring firepower across the world's oceans to pretty much anywhere you can get to by water in the earth. So you can send the ship from California to the Persian Gulf if you want to, and it can pack a lot of firepower from there. Now, obviously, if you were to try to then beach this ship on the shores of Kuwait or Iran or something, it would be a sitting duck and probably be blown up pretty quick because it can't go anywhere. Yes, it's got defenses, but it's not designed for fighting a battle on land. It's not designed to go make an assault on Baghdad. Instead, you've got to land tanks on the shores, and these are designed for movement through dirt and grass and forest and sand and all sorts of land terrain, and then deliver firepower. So this is well designed for land. It'll sink like a rock if you put it in the ocean. This is well designed for the ocean. Do nothing on land if you put it there. What if you want to move firepower, troops, between ocean and land? You've got to deliver the U.S. Army from the East Coast or from California to one of the Middle Eastern countries, because that seems to be what the U.S. does. You would have an amphibious assault vehicle that has treads like a tank and can move on the beaches, but it can also function as a boat. Not the type of thing you want to take a long voyage from California through the Pacific to the Persian Gulf, but does the job well for getting from ship to land and beaches and back. Perfect for the transitional environment. It blends the features of tanks and ships. It's a human-designed transitional form, and we don't think twice. So I grew up in Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Ducks, the amphibious assault vehicles, are now recommissioned to give you tours of the Wisconsin Dells. I grew up with this concept. Maybe you did too. And we don't think twice. We don't say, this is evidence for evolution. See, this evolved from some sort of, ship over millions of years? No, we know human engineers designed it. My point here is not to debate whether or not this creature actually existed. That's for my paleontology colleagues. I'm saying let's just pretend for sake of argument this creature once existed. Is this evidence for evolution? No, because humans designed transitional forms. God could have done so just as easily, just as well. So what they're calling evidence for evolution is equally valid evidence for creation. Which means, once again, if you're the jury, and if the evolutionists are trying to convince you evolution's true, you're stuck. They're trying to say this is evidence for evolution. Well, it's equally true, valid evidence for creation. And the only way you can call this evidence for evolution is if you eliminate the competing explanation. They haven't. So there, once again, this evidence for evolution has been neutralized. Last example, and the one example that we have of evolutionists actually trying to experimentally, scientifically eliminate the idea of creation, is this idea of bad design. So sometimes evolutionists have thought through, okay, the creationists are saying there's a designer. The creationists are saying there's a creator. Let's think through what the world should look like if it was created. Sort of a more formal way of testing a hypothesis. And they would say, well, there's all sorts of examples of things that don't look well designed. So if you have a creator, and the Bible says he is all-powerful, all-knowing, boy, he did a sloppy job. It's kind of a theological argument, but it's an effective one because they understand what the Bible teaches them to a degree, and they're trying to directly refute it with evidence. I'll give you two examples from the human body and then one from the wider biological world. They would say the human tailbone is poorly designed. Vestigial organs is another term you may have heard. Vestigial meaning leftovers, useless remnants from the evolutionary process. That's the idea here. There's actually two parts to the evolutionary argument. They would say, first of all, here's a structure, in this case, the tailbone. Doesn't seem to do anything. Pointless. Why would the designer put pointless, functionless stuff in our bodies that we just carry around and adds weight? Secondly, they would say this pointless structure makes much better sense in light of evolution, because evolution does not have a designer. Even the theistic evolutionists would again say the whole process is unguided by God. It just happens naturally. There's no purpose, no plan, no forethought. It just happens. However, the environment changes and the natural selection modifies things to make it fit. That's what they say. So they would say, number one, you can take out the tailbone. It's pointless. Why would this exist? Bad design, pointless. It refutes the idea of God's design. It makes more sense, secondly, from the perspective of human evolution. What perspective? The idea that our ancestors were once in the trees, and they had prehensile tails, like this monkey does, to grab onto trees, and that over millions of years we evolved out of the trees, and so no longer needing a prehensile tail to grab onto a branch, that just kind of degenerated into this stump that we call the tailbone. So what's the answer? Here's the evolutionist attempt, finally, to eliminate the explanation of creation so that they can use these other evidences to argue for evolution. Well, the coccyx is not functionless, or another way to say this is that the whole concept of bad design is essentially an argument from silence. We don't see evidence for function. There's no experimental demonstration of function, therefore no function. That's an inherently weak argument because all it takes is someone to do an experiment, to fill in the ignorance, to fill in the blank with evidence, and boom, the argument evaporates. So the coccyx is the site of attachment for many pelvic floor muscles. So without getting into graphic anatomy, let's just say if you know someone who's had their coccyx removed, or if you ever have it removed, you'll quickly discover bowel movements become much more painful and difficult. There is a function. It's kind of a gross function perhaps, but necessary. We all have to empty our bowels. And so this is not some leftover from evolution. God designed the body for a purpose, including having to empty our digestive tract, among other things. The pelvic floor does more than that. But this does have a function, and if you bruise it or you remove it, you're going to see the consequences real fast. So this argument evaporates. This example of bad design evaporates. One more example from the human body, perhaps one you've heard of. They would say our appendix is useless. So again, there's two parts to this argument. Number one, look, there's this little finger on the end of our colon, really at the beginning of the colon, that does nothing. You can take it out, normal surgery. They'll even mock this idea. They'll say, it seems that the only reason the designer made the appendix is to line the pockets of the surgeons who have to be paid to remove it. They think it's ridiculous. They mock it. Is it true that you can remove the appendix without much consequence? Yes. Does that mean it's functionless? No. And this is a common confusion, I think, on the part of the evolutionist, the difference between something that's functional and something that's essential. So an easy example, my hand is functional. Think of a Major League Baseball pitcher. Their hand and their whole apparatus, whole body can be used to whip a fastball 90, 100 miles an hour. Much skill, a lot of good design to be able to accomplish that task. No one would deny hand is well designed for that purpose. And that same Major League pitcher, I'm going to say most of them are probably married, can whip a fastball and then step off the mound and grab gently and affectionately the hand of a toddler. So the human hand is capable of all that. Great power and tender affection. Well designed. Can you cut off a hand? Yes. So when I was growing up, I think it was Jim Abbott, a famous pitcher, didn't have one of his hands, was still pitching, found a way to do it. Lived his life as a professional without a hand. The hand is not essential. The hand is extremely functional. The appendix is not essential. You can remove it. It is functional. It plays a role in the immune system, but it's something you can exist, you can go on living without it. So in one sense, perhaps it's an evidence of good design. So if you scrape your finger, and God designed the human body so that one little scrape ends your life, life would be miserable. What are you going to do? Wake up in the morning? How am I going to die today? But God has made the body with redundancy. That's another engineering concept. And in this case, yes, it's designed, it has a function, but it's not an essential function. Obviously, your heart is something that's functional and essential. You remove your heart, you're dead. Your appendix, you can remove, you're not dead. The other part of the evolutionary argument is they would say that the appendix not only is non-functional, which is an argument that has since disappeared, but it also fits the idea of evolution. They would say, again, we came from monkeys who were going through the trees, eating leaves. They were herbivores. They used prehensile tails. We evolved out of the trees, no longer need the tail. Now we start eating meat. And the appendix which has this role in digestion. So think about cows with their mini stomachs and such. So plant eaters, long appendix, meat eaters, short appendix. See, this fits our evolutionary past. Well, a recent study showed that there's no correlation between appendix size and diet, so even that half of the evolutionary argument goes away. These are arguments from silence. They're inherently weak. And to summarize, what used to be a long list of so-called vestigial organs, stuff in our body that does nothing, has shrunk to basically zero because science has advanced and, oh, whoops, there is a function that we missed. Destroys the evolutionary counterargument. One more example, this is from whales, baleen whales. So the evolutionists would say there's this rear bone in the whale's body that, number one, does nothing, and number two, fits the evolutionary past. How does it fit the evolutionary past? They would say, again, fish or transitional forms like Tiktaalik eventually evolved onto land, became mammals. Fish did not directly evolve into whales. They would say fish evolved into mammals, then the mammals, four-legged mammals, some wolf-like creature perhaps, evolved back into the ocean and became whales, and what was once a four-legged creature running on the land no longer needed those hind limbs, and so those hind limbs, those legs, now degenerated to this stump. No function, fits the evolutionary past. Without getting into, again, graphic detail, whales would be sexually reproducing creatures like humans. You have to have male and female, not like bacteria, which can just pop off a copy of themselves. Sexually reproducing, so water is slippery, and copulation in a slippery environment is difficult. This helps it work, and I'm not going to talk about it more without getting into birds and the bees. Ask your parents. So it's a function. It has a function. In fact, and I put this quote on the screen for a purpose, there is so much design in life that even some of the world's most hardened atheists, like Richard Dawkins, has to concede this point. He might still try to come up with examples of bad design, which, again, that list of bad design keeps shrinking. But even he has to admit biology, the study of life, is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been what? Designed for a purpose. So he has to deny that it's real design. He's like, yeah, it sure looks designed, but you have to keep telling yourself it's only an appearance. It's just a mirage. Don't believe what your lying eyes are telling you. It's not designed, even though it looks designed. This is an overwhelming testimony to the truth of Romans 1. God says he's left evidence all throughout creation of his design. No one can deny it, even the world's strongest atheist. This bad design argument is poor. So this really is what you're up against. If you're tempted to retreat from science, if you've got children, grandchildren, let's just avoid science, it's too intimidating. There isn't much in the way that's good counterarguments to creation. Don't let it intimidate you. Let me take it one step further. I've been going through this process of neutralizing evolution and saying that there's no good examples of the evolutionists eliminating scientifically the idea of creation. What if we do the reverse? Is there a way for creationists to eliminate the hypothesis of evolution experimentally? Darwin gave us a way to do so. This is a long, complicated Victorian sentence. In summary, Darwin said, evolution doesn't work by leaps. So here's something that's very popular in museums today. They like to show birds in natural history museums and say, see, these are living dinosaurs. These are the descendants of dinosaurs. Big push. Even my kids who like dinosaurs recognize this. It bothers them because it shows up everywhere. Kids shows, they put feathers on dinosaurs, normal display, sadly, these days. The idea of evolution is not that something like a velociraptor or Tyrannosaurus rex lays an egg and out pops a bald eagle. That would be a gigantic evolutionary leap. The evolutionary idea is that something like maybe a Tyrannosaurus rex, some sort of scaled reptile, let's say, slowly and gradually over millions of years, incomprehensible amounts of time, those scales become less and less scale-like and more feather-like through more primitive scale features, then primitive feather features, eventually, finally, feathers. Darwin says numerous successive slight modifications. That's the process of evolution. And so Darwin's mechanism for eliminating evolution is, he said, if you can find some structure somewhere that you cannot produce by numerous successive slight modifications, if you cannot evolve a dinosaur into a bird step by tiny inscrutable step, then evolution's a wash, breaks down. Now, the atheists don't like it when creationists quote this because they say you don't quote the next sentence. Here's the test of evolution. If we can find something you can't build step by tiny step, evolution breaks down. Darwin says, here's the next sentence, I can find out no such case. Fine, but Darwin's living in 1859. And in 1859, Darwin says, our ignorance, the whole field of science, is ignorant of the laws of variation. What he's talking about is genetics. And the reason he doesn't use the word genetics is because the field of genetics hasn't even been invented. Most genetic textbooks begin with Gregor Mendel and his experiments with pea plants. Gregor Mendel publishes his work after Darwin publishes The Origin of Species. That's how ignorant everyone is. There's no knowledge of DNA and how it is involved in heredity that comes 100 years later. So Darwin is speaking the truth when he says our ignorance of the laws of variation is profound, which means we can reevaluate this sentence. He gives us a test for evolution. He says, I find no violations of my test, but he's speaking in an era when the field of genetics doesn't even exist. So let's revisit that right now and ask if there are examples that violate his test of evolution. Male lion, female lion. Darwin has to explain this because he's trying to explain everything. Can you build a male lion and a female lion by numerous successive slight modifications? Which means then you can't evolve them in one fell swoop. It's one or the other in order. Numerous successive slight modifications. So let's say evolution successfully evolves a male lion. How is he going to pass on his male lion features, characteristics, qualities, if there's no female with which to reproduce? He's dead in the water, evolutionary speaking. And it doesn't have to be the male. You can evolve the female first. Finally, evolution builds over millions of years by numerous successive slight modifications a female lion. Now how does she pass on femaleness to the next generation if there's no male? Stuck. So the idea of sexual reproduction, having male and female, and we can now analyze this at the microscopic and molecular level, sperm and egg, there has to be very specific lock and key mechanisms encoded in DNA to make this work. You have to have it all in place or the idea breaks down. The whole process breaks down. There's all sorts of examples now with modern genetics and molecular biology of things that you cannot build by numerous successive slight modifications. The guy who advanced this idea, Michael Behe, in his famous book, Darwin's Black Box, called it irreducible complexity. There's structures in life, processes in life where you have to have all sorts of pieces in place or the system breaks down, which means you can only build the system all at once, which violates evolution. And Behe is Catholic. He's fine with billions of years of Earth history. He's fine with humans and chimpanzees having a common ancestor. But he has a silver bullet argument against evolution. So this is not from some fundamentalist preacher just pounding the pulpit. This is some guy who'd almost accept evolution, except he finds this deadly for evolution failure. So yes, we can eliminate evolution. It's been scientifically disproven multiple times. It requires miracles. So we could stop here. Should we compromise with Darwin? 99% of scientists hold evolution? No. Contradicts the Bible. Should we retreat from science? No. Number one, because the evolutionary arguments against creation have been neutralized. And secondly, we can actually turn the tables and eliminate evolution. Wash our hands, we're done, we can go home, right? Well, despite that, the statistics remain the same. 99% of PhDs hold evolution. So you walk outside this room, you go to your unsafe family, to your neighbors. Why do so many smart people disagree with you? How do you explain that? Why is it still taught in school? That's the elephant in the room. And to put it in graphical form, 99% of PhDs hold evolution, maybe 1% or so would hold to something creationist. That's what it would look like. How do you explain this? I found the answer in 2024. I was running statistics on enrollment. So I mentioned earlier that we have an annual college expo for students to come through and engage with representatives from like-minded institutions, universities that hold to creation. God created in 6 days, about 6,000 years ago. There aren't many of them. And there's publicly available enrollment data for the United States, each university, and for those universities that would be creationist in their leaning. So I ran those numbers and I said, how many students, I used undergraduate numbers just because there's many more undergraduates than graduate students, so there's a better statistical sample size. What percentage of undergraduates would hear or get some exposure to creation science or even something other than evolution, maybe older with creation, what percentage of students will go through university and be exposed to some alternative, and what percentage of students are going to go through university and hear evolution and evolution alone the entire 4 years in the classroom? The numbers are remarkable. If you blinked and you say, hey, didn't you just change the colors on that slide? In a sense, yes, but the point is, it's a perfect statistical match. 99% of college students in the United States are going to go to a university where all they will ever hear is evolution the entire time. In statistical terms, enrollment predicts outcome. What I'm telling you is the reason 99% of PhDs are evolutionists is because that's all they're ever taught. It's a manufactured consensus. That's insulting to the evolutionists because I'm basically saying they're evolutionists because they're raised that way. But it's true. That's what the math says. So the next question, of course, is why do students, 99% of them, hear only evolution? Why don't more universities teach creation science? And the answer is because they're not allowed to. The courts have made this essentially impossible. Court cases in the 1980s, there was a federal court decision regarding an Arkansas law. So Arkansas tried to mandate the teaching of creation science alongside evolution. Federal court overturned it. In 87, the Supreme Court overturned the Louisiana law. Louisiana tried to teach creation science alongside evolution. Supreme Court said no. Both of them gave similar reasoning as to why. So this is the quote from the court decision. Falsifiability is a complicated concept. I'll give you an analogy that gets us 90% of the way there. If you followed Answers in Genesis for many years, you're familiar with this analogy. This is what the courts are saying is the reason why students will hear only evolution. So we've been talking about creation evolution for many years in terms of worldview, glasses. We've been saying, and I've given examples, so transitional forms, homology, where if you have an evolutionary worldview, evidence for evolution, see? Whereas if you put the Christian glasses on, the worldview, Christianity, from Genesis 1 through 11, you'll look at the same evidence, homology, transitional forms, evidence for creation. It's a worldview issue. It's something we've been saying for a long time. And what I've done so far is essentially act like a lawyer, where even as I'm putting on the creationist glasses, I'm cross-examining the evolutionary claims. See, that's wrong. Evolutionists missed this part. They falsely reasoned here. They failed to eliminate the creationist explanation. That's cross-examination like a lawyer does. And that's what the courts said is not enough. They said this is not science. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with the courts. I'm just telling you what they said. This is why students will hear only evolution, and this is why PhDs, to the tune of 99% of them, are evolutionists, because that's what they're taught, because the courts have said lawyer work's not enough. Well, what did the courts demand? What do creationists actually have to do? Detective work. And what I mean is, the courts have said, look, the evolutionists have spent decades writing grant proposals, getting research monies to do experiments, going and doing those experiments in the lab, in the field, publishing papers, then putting them in textbooks. This whole process of detective work, finding questions, answering them, you creationists do the same thing. Go find some research money, go do some experiments, ask some questions, answer them, publish your results, and then come and talk to us. Do detective work. That's the court's standard. So, on the question of Darwin and the origin of species, we defeat Darwin, creationists do, via detective work. And the question I'm asking now is, have creationists done it? Can we do it? Have they already done it? Of course, the reason I'm bringing this up is because the answer I'm going to show you is yes. This is the new way to win. This is the quiet revolution. And I want to tell you a story. With Darwin, going back to 1831, when he sets sail on Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle, for a voyage around the globe. By this point, the mainstream evolutionary community is abandoning the idea of 6,000 years ago for God creating and going to much longer periods of time. This idea is already in place. Evolution's not there yet. We're still decades from 1859 when Darwin publishes The Origin of Species. In his voyage around the globe, he stops at the Galapagos, obtains several bird species, not very colorful or impressive, but they play a big role in the idea of evolution for years to come. 1837, John Gould sees Darwin's specimens and formally classifies the species. I'm not going to read these quotes on the screen, but if you look at some of Darwin's earlier works about Darwin's finches, you can see that these birds play a big role in his own thinking as he's processing the voyage he's been on, sees these birds, sees the differences in the shape and size of their beaks. What if, he says, There was an ancestor on, let's say, the South American mainland, one bird that flew over to these archipelago of islands, and the birds moved around, and natural selection modified and shaped these beaks. Could that be how they came to be? And that whole line of reasoning becomes formalized for the whole planet in 1859 in his book On the Origin of Species. And he says explicitly again, natural selection is the mechanism, and he says selection, this ugly process of death, and this slide is graphic for a reason, because this is the process theistic evolutionists say is very good. It's not. It's an intruder. Darwin says this happens very slowly, and again, because he's building on the work of millions of years of others prior, he says, I think this fits what geology tells us. Natural selection happens very slowly, and seems to fit this idea that the Earth is millions of years old, or whatever the time point was back then, not 6,000 years. Evolution fits geology. So he dies 1882, but his finches and their importance live on. The story resumes, for our purposes, in the 1970s on an island in this archipelago called Daphne Major. Peter and Rosemary Grant from Princeton and their team have been doing heavy lifting for decades on this. One particular finch that's been the focus is the medium ground finch. You can see some of the other finches in this slide, but the medium ground finch is in the center. Their work has been the subject of Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Jonathan Weiner, The Beak of the Finch. Their work has become textbook evidence. This is a slide from a textbook showing how the beak size changes in response to the environment. This is Exhibit A for evolution. We could have added that to our discussion of evolution when we're talking about the evidences. A bombshell announcement came in 2018 when they announced rapid hybrid speciation in Darwin's finches. What's that? They observed on Daphne Major, so this is Geospiza fortis, the medium ground finch, there was a male from a different species that flew over, mated with some of the females from this species, and produced a lineage of what they're calling big birds. These offspring are morphologically distinct. So of course, they've got all the measurements in the paper saying the beak size is different. This is the DNA era, so they did DNA analyses of the parent birds and the big birds, and the big birds are genetically distinct. And because of the way birds reproduce and how the songs are passed on between parents and offspring, they're reproductively isolated. There's lots of different definitions for what a species is, but basically everything that defines a species has been observed. I found out about this, so even though this came out in January, I found out about it in February when the evolutionists were gleefully announcing this and saying we can rub this in the creationist faces. See, look at this, what happened. Notice the title that says rapid hybrid speciation. So they observed this from, I think, the 1980s onward. So just a few decades, they watched this process of speciation happen. If you're like me, you might say, ooh, exciting. Darwin said evolution happens very slowly. Let's start acting like a lawyer and pick apart why this observation contradicts evolution. And that's a worthy pursuit. But for the courts, what they've demanded is detective work. I didn't tell you yet the rate at which Darwin's species, that new species of Darwin's finches, formed. And there's a reason for it. To do detective work, we have to somehow make a prediction. You might say, prediction, that's 2018. How can you predict that going back in time? Well, work with me here. Let's derive what the Bible says about Darwin's finches. Do you find Darwin's finches in Scripture? No, because that term, they didn't come into the attention of the scientific community until the 1800s. But you do find the Bible talk about the origin of species. The term here, the key term is kind. God creates creatures after their kind, Genesis 1, and in Genesis 6, Noah brings two of every kind on board the ark. Unfortunately, some translations say to keep the species alive. It's actually bring male and female to keep the offspring alive. That's a better translation. Long story short, if you can find out which animals can interbreed, now you've got a good sense for what a kind is. And there are different species that can interbreed. This is a zorse and a zonkey, cross between a horse and a zebra, donkey and a zebra. There's ligers, crosses between lions and tigers. There's a lot more data I could show you, but to summarize the results of lots and lots of breeding studies, and yes, horse and zebra, the zorse and the zonkey can't necessarily produce more offspring, but for reasons I don't have time to get into, that's really good by biological standards in terms of reproductive compatibility. The general rule for what a kind is not species or genus, but family. So foxes, wolves, dogs, Arctic foxes, all part of the same family. Zebras, there's 3 different species. Horses, donkeys, there's wild and domestic versions. hundreds of breeds of horses and donkeys, all those part of the same kind, which means they came from two on board the ark and diversified over 4,500 years. Lots of new species in a few thousand years. What about Darwin's finches? Well, birds in general, there's over 11,000 species alive on Earth today. In terms of kinds, less than 200 on board the ark. So that's an enormous amount of speciation in 4,500 years. The sparrow finch kind alone has over 1,000 species. Tons of new species in a few thousand years. I've given you the general principles. What about the rate? Can we determine a rate? The answer is yes, and we can do it with DNA. We can reconstruct from DNA family trees. Don't let the complexity of this intimidate you. From those family trees, we can get the timing at which species formed. If you graph it out, you find it's a linear line. And if you extrapolate in the future, it implies species will continue to form. And we can calculate the rate at which species should form. All this was published in this book, Replacing Darwin. So 11,000 bird species alive today. DNA suggests a constant linear rate of speciation since the flood. About 4,500 years ago is when the flood is. 11,000 divided by 4,500 gives you an average rate for all birds of about 2.4 new bird species per year. That's the type of data that was published in October 2017, which is several months before this paper came out in 2018. What is the rate at which Darwin's finches, this new species, formed? At that time, there were 18 species recognized. The first ones, again, brought to scientific attention in 1837 with John Gould. So 2018, back to 1837, 181 years. So that's one new species, conservatively, in 181 years. But that's just Darwin's finches. I just gave you a prediction for the whole globe of birds. So one new species per 181 years per 18 species. We really have, to my knowledge, no other example of this type of study on the planet. So this is representative of the globe. So multiply that by 11,000 species to get the answer. The prediction, once again, published prior, is 2.4 new bird species per year. That type of data was in Replacing Darwin. The observed rate in Darwin's finches, one new species per 181 years per 18 species times 11,000, is 3.4. That's almost dead-on accurate, which is crazy to think about. Darwin's finches, so this is again published 2017. You won't find this story in that book because it's a prediction. You can find the story in this other book, Replacing Darwin Made Simple, or if you can just go to our website, Bombshell, type in Bombshell, you'll pull up this article, and this article is actually two ways in which this study confirmed creationist predictions, both the timing and the mechanism. What I've just shown you is revolutionary. Exhibit A for evolution is something that creationists predicted. We have done bona fide detective work. We've met the court's standard. That's the new way to win. Yes, there's been lots of lawyer work done over the years that's been very effective, very persuasive. Makes me think maybe that's why the courts outlawed it, because it was too effective. That's the new way to win. Should we compromise with Darwin? 99% of PhDs hold evolution? No. Evolution contradicts the Bible. Plus, 99% of PhDs are evolutionists because that's all they're taught. It's a totally artificial consensus. The evidence that's cited for evolution is weak. It's easily neutralized. And in fact, we can do the reverse and eliminate evolution scientifically. Why isn't evolution eliminated from the curriculum or from the profession, from 99% of PhDs? Why do they still hold to it? Because they think creation is fundamentally religious. They think the courts have decreed that we don't do detective work, and therefore it's religious and shouldn't belong in the scientific classroom. In fact, we've done bona fide detective work on the most prominent examples, supposedly, for evolution. That's the new way for creationists to win.